Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that you're about to see concerns the doctrines of grace, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. This is the second playlist of my Pretty Good Bible Studies channel. The first playlist was Orthodox Preterism. I hope you take a look at that, and I hope you enjoy this video. All right, well, let's start out with this introduction. Grace doctrines, the doctrines of grace, the tulip doctrines, they are concerned basically with one overriding idea. How in the world is it that a sovereign God can give man free will and allow him freedom when man does things that God doesn't want him to do? In other words, God's sovereignty and the free will of man, how do they fit together? And this question has vexed philosophers and theologians for hundreds of years, and how many Christian college students have stayed up all night arguing this issue. The Christian community is divided into two camps. Today they're called Calvinists. They emphasize the sovereignty of God, and Arminians who emphasize the free will of man. I'm going to use the more traditional term Augustinian for Calvinism, because Augustine was the guy who really came up with this first, and his influence has been great over the years. All right, well, let's begin. Let me give you the contents of this overview PowerPoint. First of all, I'm going to give you an overview of the playlist of the whole series of PowerPoints, of the whole series of videos that I plan to do. And the second thing I'm going to do is give you a brief history of the doctrines of grace, starting back at the very beginning of church history, moving all the way up to the present. The third thing I'm going to do is talk about the impact of Calvinism on the world. The impact is much greater than you might think. And fourth, I'm going to discuss the issue, well, why does it matter? Why am I even doing this video, and why should you even listen to it? Well, let's begin. First of all, overview of the series. This is what the playlist will cover. The first video on the playlist is this video, which is an introduction and overview of the whole playlist. Then I'm going to talk about total depravity, which means the inability of man to choose God without God's grace. Then we're going to talk about unconditional election. This is the idea that God has chosen his chosen people, Christians, and he's done it unconditionally. There are no conditions that we have to meet in order to get saved, because we cannot meet those conditions, because we're saved by grace through faith and not by works, lest any man should boast. The fourth topic that I will cover is limited atonement. This is the idea that Jesus died only for the elect. He did not die for the lost. The fifth topic is irresistible grace. This is the idea that once God decides to save you, you're not going to resist him. He's going to get you because he chose you from the foundation of the world. That doesn't mean that you're a robot, but it means that he's got to make you born again first before you can freely, of your free will, respond to his grace, which operates first. The sixth doctrine I'll take up is the perseverance of the saints. That's the doctrine that says that once you're saved, you're always saved. Once you are saved, you will persevere until such time as you die and see Jesus face to face. Now you notice that those middle topics, the five middle topics, are in red, and they spell tulip. And the last doctrine we'll take up is hyper-Calvinism. Hyper-Calvinism is the unfortunate doctrine that states that whatever will be, is basically a fatalistic doctrine. It's a very bad doctrine. Calvinism, like all other Christian doctrines, or most other Christian doctrines, has an extreme that needs to be dealt with. We'll take that up last. All right, I'm going to start on the second part of this overview by talking about a history of the doctrines of grace. First of all, we're going to talk about Augustine and the Pelagian controversy, and this is where it all starts. And by the way, this is standard church history. It's very standard. All these topics are always covered. In fact, I taught a church history course at a college once, and I went through all this basically like I'm going to do now. After Augustine dies, we're going to look at the influence that Augustine had and the period from Augustine to the Reformation. Then we're going to look at the Reformation itself, C, and then D, we are going to look at Arminius's reaction against the Calvinists who came out of the Reformation, the Augustinians, and we'll look at Arminius and the Synod of Dort, which came after Arminius, which is very critical and a key synod in this controversy. And then after the Synod of Dort until now, we'll look at that as our fifth period of history. All right, we'll start out first to review here Augustine and the Pelagian controversy. Second, we'll talk about between Augustine and the Reformation. Third, we'll talk about the Reformation itself. Fourth, we'll talk about Arminius and the Synod of Dort, which happened right after he died. And then we'll look at the Doctrines of Grace today. All right, starting out with Augustine and the Pelagian controversy. Let's look at grace before Augustine. Now, Augustine's dates are 354 to 430. These are sort of nice to remember when he lived and died, basically at the end of the 300s and beginning and the first 3 decades of the 400s. There wasn't much emphasis in the early church about grace. In fact, the famous evangelical scholar F.F. Bruce, in his book The Spreading Flame, said that there was a strange disappearing act after the Apostle Paul, and grace just disappeared. He said this: the biblical doctrine of grace seems almost to go underground in the post-apostolic age, to reappear only with Augustine. So Augustine is a key figure in the doctrine of grace because he's the guy that revived the Pauline doctrine of grace that had sort of disappeared. Now, the typical belief of early church fathers was semi-pelagianism, which is that we can choose God without his help, and once we choose, then he helps us. In other words, and the way I'm going to look at this is there's 2 things to think about. First is your belief. Second is your salvation. And theologians back then, or Christians back then, would come up with different positions on each one of these aspects of the Christian experience. Your salvation. Did God need to give you faith first and then you had faith? And then once you had faith, the next question is, well, do you believe, are you saved because of your efforts, or does God need to save you? Well, now, typically the early church fathers went half and half on this. They said, we can choose God all we want without God's help. We have perfect free will. We can choose God even though we're sinners. We can choose. But once we choose, then he has to give us grace in order to get us saved. That position is called semi-pelagianism. I will explain the term later, but right now just remember that's semi-pelagianism. Now, even at this time, even though the church was not articulating the doctrines of grace, many ordinary Christians experienced the grace. They might not have been able to put theological words on it, but they did experience, because you can't be a believer without experiencing Jesus' grace. So we do need to mention that. All right, so Augustine comes along, and as you see, maybe the end of the 300s, he's starting to operate. He was born in 354. Now here's what Augustine believed about grace. He believed that a sinner is completely in bondage to sin. Bondage. Slavery. And that means he doesn't want to choose God. He cannot choose God because he doesn't want to. And even if he did want to and did choose God, and even if he did want to choose to believe, he couldn't choose to believe. So Augustine said, the sinner doesn't want to choose God, and granted that even if he did want to choose God, he wouldn't be able to choose God. So he doesn't want to, and he's not able to choose God. So he was saying everything is of grace. Your desires to choose God and your ability to choose God is totally by grace. All right, so then Augustine got himself involved in a rip-roaring controversy with a British guy named Pelagius, who was also born the same year as Augustine, 354, and died right about the same time, between 420 and 440. The scholars aren't sure. Augustine died in 430. So they were complete contemporaries, and their controversy is really nice for future Christians because we can now see the issues so clearly because of this controversy. Now, Pelagius was a respectable British gentleman who came to Rome to work with the urban poor. And when he got to Rome, he looked around and said, you know, the church is awfully unholy. People are sinning like crazy. There needs to be something done about that. And at some point in his life, he had read Augustine's famous book, Confessions, and Augustine had made a famous quote in that book. He said, give me the grace to do as you command, and then command me to do what you will. In other words, Augustine was saying that I can't do anything you want unless you give me the grace to do it. You can command me to do all kinds of things like love my enemies, but I can't do it unless you give me the grace. Well, to me, that seems almost mundane, obvious, but Pelagius didn't think so. He thought that all the commands of God, you could do it without his grace. You could do what if God tells you to love your neighbors, you can on your own love your neighbors without God's help. You're just supposed to follow his commands. All right, so let's look at Pelagius's three beliefs. He had three beliefs, and these beliefs will frame the issue for us for later videos. First of all, he said humans are not born sinners. They sin because of bad examples in the environment. Now, how many times have you heard that before? John Dewey, the famous American educator, Karl Marx, Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. They all say that we were born good. And I've often said this is the dumbest thing that any human being ever came up with. How can you read a novel? How can you read the newspaper? How can you watch the news? How could anybody think that mankind is born good? Self-conceit maybe, or self-deceit maybe. But anyway, Pelagius believed that man was born good. He said there is no original sin. Now, what's original sin? The original sin is sin that has its origin in Adam. For example, Dan Trotter was born a sinner, and the origin of that sin was Adam, so that's original sin. Sin that comes from the origin, comes from Adam. But Pelagius didn't believe in original sin. He said Adam's sin had no effect on the individual. So the fact that Adam sinned a long time ago has no effect on Dan Trotter being a sinner when he was born. Second of Pelagius' three beliefs, he says that humans have free will to choose Jesus. Grace is a gift of choice, not a gift of salvation. In other words, the very fact that God gave us free will, that's what grace is. He was gracious enough to give us free will. But once we have our free will, we don't need God anymore. We can freely choose the good. We can freely choose to follow Jesus. But grace is not the gift of salvation. Grace is the gift of choice, not the gift of salvation. The third of Pelagius' beliefs is this: Christians are capable of perfection. So Christians should live almost perfect lives. In other words, Christians can fulfill all the commands of Christ. Love your enemies. Don't hate people. Don't get angry. Don't cheat, don't lie, don't steal, don't kill. All those things, we can do it. We don't need God's grace to do it. Well, as you can see, this is pretty radical stuff. And Augustine fought him to the death over the years. It's great to read the details of the controversy, but I'm just going to summarize Augustine's beliefs, which are in sharp juxtaposition to the beliefs of Pelagius. First of all, Augustine said that sinners are both unwilling and unable to do good. They don't want to follow Jesus, and they're not able to follow Jesus. Of course, Pelagius would deny both of those propositions. Number two, Augustine said that original sin is true. Adam fell, so mankind fell. Pelagius denied that. Abraham said, number three, we're only free to choose what we want to do, and the only thing we want to do is to sin. So yeah, now Augustine never denied anybody's free will. He was just saying that because we're so fallen, the only way that we exercise our free will is to choose evil. We can choose whether to go to this college or that college, to marry this person or that person, whether to lie down or sit up, sure, but you can't choose Jesus because you're dead and you have no desire for his love, grace, and mercy. Number four of Augustine's belief, he says God's grace is necessary for our salvation. We cannot get saved on our own. Pelagius actually denied that. He thought that human beings could, on their own efforts, keep the law and thus be saved and be justified in God's sight. Augustine's fifth belief here is that God's grace is given freely. In other words, Christians cannot work to get it. They can't go to church, go to Sunday school, put money in the offering plate, help little old ladies across the street, vote in every election, whatever. They can't do all that kind of stuff in order to make God accept them into the beloved. God's grace is given freely, which means he just gives it to us. And we respond to that with good works. We do not earn it with good works. We only respond to God's grace with good works. The sixth thing that Augustine believed is that all men deserve hell, not heaven. The only thing, Augustine believed in God's justice, but what he said was that justice only promises death and hell because we're all sinners. Number 7, Augustine said that God chooses an elect or chosen people from mankind for salvation, and those who are not chosen go to hell. So-called double predestination, which is a logical thing. If you got a mass of unsaved people and God chooses some of them to get saved and the rest are not, it's only logical. It's a logical implication, an inescapable logical implication, in my humble opinion, that once that elect is saved and the rest don't go to heaven, and they're damned to hell. Well, then that means that God chose the elect and he chose those who are not of the elect. Now, of course, this is the part of Augustine that really drives Arminians crazy, but that's what he believed. I'm not misstating the case here. Furthermore, God has not revealed why some are elect and some are not. It's in his counsel, in his mind. There's no standard of why. If you think about the people who get saved, some people are really jerks, but they get saved, and some of the nicest people you'll ever meet are not saved. It's not based on works, and we don't know why God did it that way. The 8th belief of Augustine is that the Christian should not sin that grace may abound. This, of course, follows Paul's teaching, who kept emphasizing grace. He emphasized grace. He kept saying, God's going to forgive you, God's going to forgive you. Then somebody said, well, Paul, if God's going to forgive us so much, why don't we just go out and sin so that he can forgive us more? That means we get to see more of his grace. And Paul said, God forbid. Well, Augustine agreed with Paul on that point. By the way, I should point out, the fact that Paul was accused of advocating grace so much that people could sin to get more grace, that shows he was an Augustinian, because nobody would ever say that of an Arminian, because Arminians don't emphasize grace that much. All right, now let's take the period from Augustine to the Reformation. Augustine died in 430. The next year, there was the famous Third Ecumenical Council. The first 6 ecumenical councils, of course, are accepted by Catholics, by Orthodox, and by Protestants too, for that matter. These councils established things like the 2 persons and the 1 person and 2 nature view of the person of Christ, the Holy Trinity. Big stuff. These are big important councils. And the Third Ecumenical Council condemned Pelagianism. And so Pelagianism is, for the history of the church, is bye-bye. It's considered absolute heresy, even by Catholics. Unfortunately, Augustine didn't get to see his ultimate victory. However, even though the Third Ecumenical Council in 431 AD condemned Pelagianism, the monasteries, which had lots of influence back then, if you know the history of monasticism, they didn't like Augustine's doctrine that grace was free and unconditional. They didn't like it. They didn't like the fact, first of all, they didn't like Augustinianism because they said this teaching seems novel. That's because they didn't know anything about the Bible. If they read the Apostle Paul, they would know it was not novel. It was not new. But the monks, hidebound traditionalists, sitting in their monasteries under their cows and trying to do good works, whipping themselves, giving alms to the poor, begging for alms and then giving them to the poor. And they felt all their good works. They did educational works too. They did hospital stuff. They fed the poor. They did a lot of good stuff. And they felt like, you mean, Augustine, you're saying that all our good works aren't going to earn our salvation? And of course, Augustine, if he were there present, he would say, you're doggone right. That's what I mean. And the monks didn't like that. And so they would not teach it, and they taught against it. However, Augustinianism made a comeback at the Synod of Orange in 529. Orange is a place in southern France, and at this synod, the assembled bishops partially embraced Augustine. They said that grace was needed for man to believe. They also said grace was needed for man to get saved, of course, but that was not the issue. The question is how can you choose God? And of course, the Pelagians said, no, we can choose God on our own. We don't need God's grace to do that. However, the Augustinianism that was affirmed at the Synod of Orange was by later people called semi-Augustinianism, because his doctrine of double predestination was condemned. You recall, double predestination means that if God elects some, that means he, by logical implication, damns some. They didn't go along with that, but they went along with the fact that you need to have grace in order to believe. Now, what happened after the Synod of Orange in 529 AD? Well, we want to go from that period to the Reformation, and one term can describe what happened in that period, and that's semi-pelagianism. Semi-pelagianism. Man cooperates with God in salvation. How? Man chooses, not with God. God doesn't help him. He chooses on his own, but then God has to save us. We can't save ourselves, but we can choose. So that's called semi-pelagianism. Full Pelagianism would be man chooses and man saves himself. Semi-pelagianism is man chooses God, but God saves us. Now, this is the main view all the way to the Reformation, so we're talking about another 1,000 years, semi-pelagianism. Now, let me summarize this. Pelagianism means that man believes on his own and is saved on his own. Semi-pelagianism states that man believes on his own and is saved by God. Augustinianism believes that man believes only with God's grace and he's saved by God. So if you could just remember this summary right here, you'll understand much of what follows in the videos to come. And I'm just focusing on two aspects of our salvation: our choice to believe and our actual salvation, what God does when he saves us. Those two things. Let me put what I'm talking about into tabular form. Here I've got the three doctrines I want you to distinguish here at this early stage of the piece, and I'm going to look at two different aspects of the Christian life that these doctrines dealt with, namely our ability to believe, which I've labeled belief here, or our ability to get saved, which I've called salvation. All right, Pelagianism says that man believes on his own without God's help, and he can get saved on his own without God's help. Semi-Pelagianism says that man can believe on his own, he can choose Christ freely on his own without divine grace to help him, but if he's going to get saved, he's got to have God to save him. So semi-Pelagianism disagrees with Pelagianism right here. Pelagianism believes that man can save himself. Semi-Pelagianism says no, only God can save us, even though that man chooses to believe in him first. Augustinianism, on the other hand, said that God on his own gives us the ability to believe. Now, we do believe, but it's only because God gives us the ability to believe first. We can't believe on our own. So God on his own gives us the ability to believe, and then, of course, God on his own gets us saved. All right, now we're at the Reformation. There's Luther. There's Luther right there. There's Calvin right there. Now, the Magisterial Reformation was heavily Augustinian. Magisterial Reformation, of course, is Luther and Calvin and Zwingli down in Switzerland. We'll just focus on Luther and Calvin. The two greatest works that were produced in the Reformation were Luther's On the Bondage of the Will. On the Bondage of the Will. Fantastic book. You should read it. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's another fantastic book, influential book, a seminal work. You should read it. It's amazing how many Christians have not read those two books. Well, they were heavily Augustinian. They talked all about predestination and grace and so forth. So the Reformation was a Augustinian time. The English Reformation, which, of course, came a little bit after with Henry VIII, it was heavily Augustinian. The Doctrines of Grace were in the 39 Articles of the Church of England. The 39 Articles, of course, are the founding document, or I should say the constitutional document, if you will, of the Church of England. Heavily Augustinian. All right, so what's the situation now? After the Reformation, a theologian in the Dutch Reformed Church who died in 1609. So we're talking about in the last part of the 1500s is when he was operating. This is after the Reformation, of course, maybe half a century later. He decided that all this Augustinianism was not good for him. He didn't like it. And so he started deviating a lot from Augustinianism. Well, he influenced a lot of people. He died in 1609, but the people he influenced, he was a university professor, smart guy. I hate to say that university professors are smart because I've known a lot of them, having been one myself, and there's a lot of them that I promise you are not smart. But Arminius was, and his fellow Arminians, those who followed his doctrines, were called Arminians. They wrote up something called the Remonstrances in 1610. This was a theological protest against Augustinianism, the reigning Augustinianism of the Reformation. So the Arminians protest with 5 points, and they're later known as the 5 points of Arminianism, and I'm going to go through them. And what you will notice is basically tulip from the Arminian point of view, and a lot of people don't realize is that the Calvinist doctrine of tulip was in direct reaction to Arminianism. All right, well, let's look at the first of the 5 points, partial human depravity. Remember, the Calvinists say tulip, total depravity. The Arminians say partial human depravity. They say man's free will was not depraved. Now remember, depravity means inability. It does not mean that you're like Adolf Hitler. It just means you're unable to choose God. And Arminians say, yes, man does have the free will to choose God. Point number 2, the Arminians said, election is on the basis of foreseen faith. It's not unconditional because God wants it. It doesn't matter what we want. God saves us. He says, no, God doesn't know who's going to get elected, except that he looks down the tunnel of time and he sees man's free choices, and then he bases his election conditioned upon our free choice. He chooses based on what he sees man do freely. I don't know how in the world a God outside of time can get stuck inside the tunnel of time to see what happens. I've never have understood that. And in fact, that's one reason why I'm a Calvinist to this day, because of that particular doctrine. Now, the third doctrine of Arminians is the doctrine of universal atonement. And this is what 99% of all Christians believe today. I don't. But the 99% of Christians do believe it. They say that Jesus died for everybody on the cross. How could you deny that? Well, the Arminians said that, yes, Jesus died for everything. His atonement was not limited to the elect. We'll talk about that later when we get there. That's a favorite doctrine. A lot of Calvinists choke on that one. Number 4, resistible grace. Not irresistible grace, but resistible grace. Sinners are able to resist God's call to salvation, said the Arminians. Whereas Calvinists say, or Augustinians say, oh yes, once God decides to choose you and call you, you cannot resist his grace. And the fifth point of Arminianism, Arminians believe that there is a possibility that Christians can lose their salvation, which of course Calvinists and Augustinians deny. All right, well, as a response to Arminius and the remonstrances of 1610, there was a Synod of Dort because there was a huge controversy going on in the Dutch church there, Dutch Reformed Church. So here's the Augustinian response to the remonstrances. The famous TULIP acronym, which is what I named my playlist because it describes just perfectly the doctrine so well. So they came up with TULIP in response to the Arminians. First of all, the Calvinists believed in T, total depravity. Even our will is depraved and fallen. In other words, we are unable to choose God. We don't want to choose God. Our will is not free to choose God. The Arminians said our will is free to choose God. And then unconditional election, the U in TULIP. God's choice of sinners is not preconditioned on the sinner's choice of God. God chooses sinners. There is no condition that the sinner must make a choice first. It's God's choices first, not the sinner's choice. There is no condition to his choice of us as Christians. The third L in limited atonement, in TULIP, is limited atonement or definite atonement. God shed his blood only for the elect. He didn't, and the reason Calvinists say this is because if he shed his blood for somebody who didn't get saved, that means his blood failed in its purpose. And that means his sacrifice failed, and God doesn't sponsor any flops. The I in Tulip is irresistible grace. An elect sinner cannot resist God's call. If he was elect before the foundation of the world and God calls him, well, obviously he can't resist, because if he resists grace, then he would screw up God's choice that God made before the foundation of the world to save that person. So logically, the grace is irresistible. He will, without a doubt, be saved. And finally, the P of the 5 points of Calvinism in Tulip, the perseverance of the saints. That means a Christian will persevere. Once he's saved, he'll persevere all the way to the end of his life, and he'll see Jesus face to face when he dies. A Christian will never lose his salvation. Now, the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 1619 ratified the 5 points of Calvinism. The Tulip Doctrine became official doctrine of the Dutch Reformed Church at the Synod of Dort. Dordrecht is a place in Holland. And so this is to Calvinists, to Presbyterians, to Reformed people, the Synod of Dort is a very important synod, and you should know about it if you want to know anything about your fellow Calvinist and Reformed Christian brethren. All right, now let's look at the doctrines of grace today. It's interesting. There's been a resurgence of Calvinism after I got out of seminary in 1975. It turns out that Calvinism sort of took off in the evangelical church. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes to show that. This one is from by a writer in the Christian Science Monitor. I'm going to just read the red first, the highlighted portion of the quote, of the quotation. Calvin's theology is winning over many Christians, says this guy. Let me read the whole quote. Today, Calvin's theology is making a surprising comeback, challenging the me-centered prosperity gospel of much of modern evangelicalism with a God-first immersion in Scripture. Immersion in Scripture. In an age of materialism and made-to-order religion, Calvinism's unmalleable, that means unchangeable, unmalleable doctrines in view of God as an all-powerful potentate who decides everything is winning over many Christians, especially the young. Well, that's amazing that young people are actually going for something that's smart. I think this is a wonderful thing, in my humble opinion, because I do not like the me-centered prosperity gospel of much of modern evangelicalism. There's a lot of modern evangelicalism that's really shameful and uninspiring, and so a lot of people are turning to Calvinism as a response. Let me give you another quote. This is from the same author in the Christian Science Monitor. He says, in the Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant body, at least 10% of its pastors identify as Calvinists, while more than 1/3 of recent seminary graduates do. Actually, I don't think that's an awful lot. That sounds like a small amount to me. But the Baptist Church is still majority Arminian. However, more and more of them are starting to see the light. All right, third part of this overview. The impact of Calvinism on the world. What is the impact of Calvinism on the world? Let me give you a quote from a gentleman I found on the internet, Mark Thompson. The quote goes like this: Calvin can legitimately lay claim to being one of the most influential of all Western thinkers. Calvinism is a movement that has not only contributed to the origin of the modern world, but has played a socially and ecclesiastically significant role on all continents down to the present day. Now, usually when Christians think of Calvinism, they think of this free will, sovereignty of God debate, Calvinist, Arminian, and they think theologically. But let's look at historically and socio-economically, culturally. This is how much impact Calvinism has had on the modern world, the modern Western world. In economics, Calvinism helped destroy feudalism. It gave rise to free market economics. In fact, that famous guy, Weber, the German sociologist, called, what did he say, the Protestant ethic and the rise of capitalism. He combined the idea of the Protestant ethic and capitalism. And free market economics has done an awful lot. It's abolished feudalism. It abolished slavery. It's taken masses of people out of poverty and given them a chance to not live a life of grinding poverty and starvation. How about in government? Calvinism gave the idea to that the state should be limited and non-oppressive. He was opposed to the divine right of kings, for example. Calvinists started had synodical church government, which led to popular democracy. The idea is that you vote on things. Calvin did not believe in the divine right of kings. He believed that people could revolt against tyrants. There was no divine right of kings. Well, you could imagine what a huge impact that has on modern Republican democracy. In education, he said that education is for all, irrespective of age, gender, or wealth. Universal education is widely accepted today. Calvin pushed that very hard. He said education was to include the natural world, not just theology, but also the sciences. On marriage and family, he opposed monasticism and clerical celibacy, which in my opinion has led to all kinds of mischief and bad stuff in the Catholic Church. But, as you know, Calvin was married. He encouraged marriage for all adults. He he advocated the strict control of premarital sex. Of course, that had a great influence on the world for a long time. That's broken down now as people living like barnyard animals don't seem to care, and they're living with the consequences of it. The sexual revolution ain't so free anymore. He said that both spouses could divorce for adultery. Both spouses, not just the man, but the woman. Back then, only the man could sue for adultery. In the areas of science, he said that we need to use the experimental method instead of just thinking with pure logic. We have to use inductive methods of science instead of just deductive methods of philosophy, because the human reason has been marred and defaced because of the fall, and therefore reason doesn't work all the time. It messes up. So therefore, you can come up with a scientific theory, but you better back it up with empirical experimental methods to prove it, rather than just basing it on sheer logic. Well, that's the inductive method of science. That's well known today. And last of all, in law, one of my favorite subjects since I used to be a lawyer, he opposed ecclesiastical law, and as a result, Protestants ended up being behind, and Calvinists ended up being behind the idea that there should be a legal system that's apart from the church and apart from the state. In other words, we don't have the king's court and we don't have the church's court. We have an independent judiciary, is what I'm trying to say. These are huge influences. Now, this is the same guy that I can't think of his name. Jimmy Swaggart. This is the guy that Jimmy Swaggart said had sent 1 million people to hell. This is the guy that ignoramuses get on the internet and say that he was a murderer because of the Servetus affair, which we won't get into here, but you'd be surprised how that's been twisted. This is a guy that's just some kind of an ogre, some kind of a monster. Jimmy Swaggart wouldn't even have a pulpit to preach from if it wasn't for John Calvin, despite the fact that Swaggart denounces him constantly. So, big impact. Last part of this overview, why does it matter? Why does it matter that whether you should understand or even believe in Augustinianism? First of all, there's four reasons. First of all, God gets glory and man does not in this system of theology. The system of theology emphasizes emphasizes God's glory and not man's choice. God chooses to his glory, not man chooses to give God glory. The second aspect of Augustinianism that matters very much is we're confident in our salvation, as I'll show you later. The third, we're confident in our salvation because once we're saved, we're always saved. We have encouragement for holiness. Paul in Ephesians says we're saved for good works. I'll show you that verse in just a minute. So we're encouraged to be holy. And last of all, we have a better understanding of man's utter sinfulness and God's wrath. And that's something that people don't talk about today, is how sinful man is and how angry God is about it. You go to the average evangelical church, you're not going to hear that. All right, let's start first of all. Augustinianism says that God gets glory and man does not, because our salvation ultimately depends on God's work, not our work. The chief end of man is not to do good works, but rather to glorify God by our works. We do good works, but the purpose is to give God glory, not to get up in front of a Kiwanis club and say what kind of good civic deeds you did. The second reason why Augustinianism matters is because we're confident in our salvation. Nothing, absolutely nothing can separate us from the love of God, as Paul says in Romans 8. That gives confidence, because this life is very, very difficult, and it would be very easy to think that God doesn't love me anymore, he's going to let me die or let me go to hell or something. No. The third reason it matters to believe in Calvinism or the doctrines of grace or Augustinianism is we have encouragement for holiness. Here's the verse I promised I was going to quote to you. Ephesians 1:4. He chose us, there's election, he chose us in him, in Christ, before the foundation of the world, before the world was even made, before you were born, he chose you. Why? That we should be holy and blameless before him. That was his whole purpose of choosing us, his whole purpose of electing us, so that he could transform us from glory to glory until we are conformed perfectly, transformed from one state of holiness to the next state of holiness until we are totally conformed to the image of his glory. So, we have encouragement for holiness. The last reason why it matters that we believe in these doctrines is that we have a better understanding of man's utter sinfulness and God's wrath. Do non-Calvinists preach judgment and hell? I just said, you go to a typical evangelical church, you're not going to hear about judgment and you're not going to hear about hell, which means the church is just like the culture today. Oh, don't judge me. Oh, I don't think you should rape somebody. I don't think you should kill somebody. Don't put your morality on me. I don't think you should have premarital sex. I don't think you should be a homosexual. Don't judge me. Sir or ma'am, if you continue to violate God's will, there will be eternal punishment because you're not covered for your sins. There is wrath built into the universe that God put there. When is the last time you ever heard a Christian preacher or any Christian talk like that? The idea is almost totally lost to our culture, and we better get it back, because our culture is going to be like the world in the days of Noah, where God's going to have to wipe us all out and start all over again. We're getting so corrupt. Our culture does not fear God, and we're sinking into the abyss. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next one.